Over 500 years ago, in the sweltering heat of July, the cobblestone streets of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, became the stage for one of the most peculiar and haunting events in recorded history. A woman named Frau Troffea stepped out of her modest house, her shoes hitting the dusty street. No sooner had she arrived outside when she began to dance, not joyfully, not gracefully, but with a frenzied, frantic energy. There was no music to guide her, no festival to excuse her wild movements. She offered no explanation, nor did she seem aware of her surroundings. Frau Troffea simply danced. At first, her neighbors looked on in confusion. Was this a joke? A fit of madness? An act of protest? Whatever the reason, nobody tried to stop her. Instead, the onlookers chuckled nervously, shaking their heads. She will tire soon, they thought. But the minutes turned into hours, and Frau Troffea did not. Sweat poured from her brow as she spun in place, her legs flailing erratically. Her body trembled, and her lips whispered what seemed like incoherent prayers. She danced long into the night, and to the horror of those who witnessed her, she did not stop, not even when her feet began to swell and bleed against the stone streets. By morning, Frau Troffea was still dancing. Within a week, what started as the bizarre actions of one woman spiraled into something incomprehensible. Frau Troffea was carried home by her husband, who was at wit's end, but the moment she recovered her strength, she returned to the streets and resumed her eerie dancing. Stranger still, others began to join her. First, it was neighbors, one or two acquaintances who perhaps believed they were caught up in some spiritual awakening. But soon, strangers from other corners of Strasbourg came as if summoned by the spectacle and began to mimic her frenzied spasms. Men, women, even children took to the streets, and none of them could stop once they started. The city square transformed into a raw, grotesque scene of chaos, bodies spinning, writhing, stomping, and collapsing in exhaustion. Some screamed in fear, others laughed maniacally, but their feet kept moving as though propelled by forces beyond human will. Blood stained the streets. A strange, chilling harmony seemed to hang in the air. No sound of instruments, no melodies sung, only the rhythmic slap of bruised and broken feet against the ground. By the end of the month, over 400 people had joined the dance. Many of them were mere skeletons of their former selves, their bodies wasting away from exhaustion, starvation, or dehydration. Some collapsed from heart attacks or strokes, their bodies simply unable to take the relentless movement. Yet even in death, their faces remained locked in wide-eyed expressions of hysteria, a grotesque reflection of the torment their final moments must have held. The sudden eruption of this dancing plague spread fear and confusion throughout Strasbourg. The city council, desperate for answers, called upon the greatest physicians and scholars of the time. Was this a curse? Divine punishment? Physicians consulted their books and proposed hot blood, a medical diagnosis that suggested that people's bodies were literally overheating due to imbalances in their humors. The cure, the doctors believed, was to allow the dancers to expunge the fever by continuing to dance. And so, in their infinite wisdom, the authorities made matters worse. Musicians were hired to provide accompaniment to the sufferers, and a stage was constructed in the city square to give the dancers more room. Anyone who felt even a twinge of dizziness or delusion was encouraged to join. The city's logic was simple: allow the dancing to burn out on its own. But instead, the conditions spread even faster. Entire families began to march into the streets, bodies jerking and twisting together in grotesque unison, their faces pale and drawn, their limbs bruised and broken. The eerie mass of humanity, convulsing ceaselessly, began to resemble a macabre festival of death. Spiritual explanations soon followed. Some believed the plague was the work of Saint Vitus, a martyred saint through whom God was punishing Strasbourg for its sins. The afflicted, it was said, were cursed, or worse, possessed. Rumors of witchcraft and demonic forces rippled through the population. Desperate clergy performed exorcisms and ritual prayers for deliverance, but these efforts failed in the face of whatever malevolent spirit seemed to grip the city. By mid-August, the dancing plague was at its zenith. Hundreds of dancers filled the square at all hours of the day and night, a constant tide that never ebbed. There were those who tried to help. Relatives and friends of the afflicted would wade into the human storm to provide water or carry dancers away. Yet many of the helpers were struck by the plague themselves, as if joining hands or coming too close was enough to trigger the compulsion. The faces of the dancers told stories of their suffering. Their haunted eyes glimmered as if pleading silently for salvation. The pain was written across their bodies: scarred feet, swollen ankles, ribs poking through stretched skin. Some screamed of visions, angels, demons, fiery torment. Others mumbled incoherently, seemingly locked away in their own minds. Those who survived described it as madness, as though invisible strings had hijacked their limbs, refusing to let them rest. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the plague seemed to stop. In late August, the council, exhausted and humiliated, organized a pilgrimage to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus. They gathered the afflicted and brought them, barefoot and battered, to the saint's sacred altar, where offerings of bread, wine, and money were made. At the shrine, the dancers were made to wear red shoes, believed to calm the disorder caused by Saint Vitus's curse. Miraculously, or coincidentally, the dancing began to fade. One by one, the afflicted collapsed completely, no longer writhing or crying out. By September, the horrifying epidemic was over. What triggered the dancing plague of 1518? Historians and scientists have puzzled over this question for centuries, but no definitive answer has emerged. Some argue that the plague was a form of mass hysteria, a psychological phenomenon where contagious anxiety or stress manifests in physical symptoms. It's worth noting that 16th century Strasbourg was plagued by famine, poverty, and disease, not to mention the oppressive social and religious pressures of the time. Perhaps the dancing was a dark, collective response to unimaginable despair. Others suggest ergot poisoning, caused by consuming rye bread contaminated with a toxic fungus. This fungus, ergot, can produce hallucinogenic effects and erratic muscle spasms, symptoms eerily similar to those described in historical accounts of the plague. And then there are the supernatural theories, whispers of curses, demonic possession, or divine retribution that remain widely discussed in folklore. Whatever the explanation, the dancing plague left its mark, an eternal scar etched into the annals of history. It's a tale that defies easy categorization, straddling the line between science and the supernatural, fact and legend. To this day, it remains one of the strangest and most unsettling phenomena humanity has ever witnessed, a chilling reminder of how fragile the human mind and body can be when confronted with the incomprehensible. But perhaps the most haunting thought of all is this: could it happen again? Can the raw chaos of human fear and suffering erupt once more in a dance of death, unchecked and unexplained? History holds its secrets, and the dancing plague of 1518 remains one of its most cryptic. Dare we tread too lightly on that thin line between sanity and madness?